There are two words that appear in this text, and as so often happens in the book of Ephesians and in the Bible generally, these are words that we don't use anymore. They're words that if we do use them, we only use them sarcastically. And so we've seen that with the word worthy back at the beginning of chapter 4. Let me give you two more that appear in this passage. One is the word proper. This is a word that no one ever uses positively today. We always, when we speak of someone who is proper, what we mean is they're stuffy. They're a little bit stiff. And so this idea of being proper, we associate with etiquette. The original definition here is much more about characteristics that are very prominent to you and very appropriate to your position or the role that you play. So it used to be that we would all watch the news on television, and the old famous newscaster was Walter Cronkite, and he was very proper because he had a voice that inspired trust. He had a cadence when he delivered the news that people just responded to. And it was there was a sense here that when Walter Cronkite was talking, it was important to listen to what he said. This was the man who delivered the news to us famously about the Kennedy assassination. He was walking us through the first moon landing on live television. And so there was this sense of the propriety of his voice and the appropriateness of how he spoke about the news. So that's one word that is here. And the question this word raises for us is, what is proper for a Christian? What is the pronounced characteristic that a Christian has where when someone sees it or hears it, they say, that's what I'm talking about. That's what a Christian is. Another word, fitting. This also appears in this passage here. And here again, it's not a word that we use in this sense in quite the same way. This word is about the appropriateness of what you're doing, the way you're behaving, how you're acting, the appropriateness of your attitude to not just your situation, but who you are, your identity as a person. And so this is the idea that you can have an identity and act in a way that is not fitting to who you are. It is not appropriate. So let's think of it this way. What's the standard for a good wristwatch? I don't happen to wear a wristwatch. It's just not something I do, but let's just, for the sake of argument, say I was wearing them. What would be the standard of a good wristwatch? What would be fitting for a wristwatch? Well, it's got to tell time. That's kind of the first thing. But it also has to be portable. It has to fit around my wrists and not interfere with everything else that I'm doing. It shouldn't be clunky. So let's suppose that I got one of those old alarm clocks that used to sit on people's side table that had two bells on the sides of the top, and it would ring and you would smack it in order to stop it ringing. Let's suppose I take one of those things and I somehow tie with some twine. I tie that thing to my wrist. And let's further suppose that this alarm clock is broken. It does not tell time. So is that a fitting wristwatch? And no, it's not. It doesn't meet the standard for what it is supposed to be. it's too big. That twine is going to be pretty uncomfortable after a while. And I go to all the work of putting that thing on my wrist, and I still don't know what time it is. So it's no good. This is a word that is saying that it is possible to be a Christian and act in a way that is not fitting. It's not appropriate. It isn't a match with who you are. So, two words that appear in this passage that are, we would say, very old-fashioned and not words that we would use normally. And if we did use them, we would be referring to etiquette, good manners at the table or wherever you happen to be. And that's about as far as we would go with it. The last thing I'll observe about these two words is that they are about ethics, not etiquette. They are about right and wrong, not good or bad manners. So this isn't about being stuffy. It's not about being stiff. It's about being good, right, deeply appropriate to who you are. And I'll just say that these two words have, for most of our history, always been about ethics. Because the idea that there are good things to do and wrong things to do has always been associated with beauty, appropriateness, and a sense of proportion to life. So the Bible is coming to us this morning, as it always does, but with these words in particular, it's coming to us almost like from the antique store. Oh, look at that. That's what people used to do. This is the way people used to think. So let's consider the principle of this passage, that the proper, fitting attitude, behavior for a Christian is to be like a beloved child. That is the most appropriate, good thing for a Christian to do and to be, is to behave like a beloved child. Here I found this picture of a print by William Blake called The Boy Who Was Found, or something like that. He's lost in the woods, and his parent comes and finds him. And you just see this little boy gazing up at the parent with a kind of adoration. And so we'll talk about this from the passage this morning. There is a deep contrast here, beginning chapter 5, verse 1. Therefore, be imitators of God as beloved children, and walk in love as Christ loved us and gave himself up for us, a fragrant offering and sacrifice to God. So, we are to be children. Now, here's kind of an ironic thing. Back in chapter 4, we were commanded in verse 14 that we were to no longer be children. Remember that? In that passage, a child is a minor, somebody who is under 18, shouldn't be running the family business, shouldn't be making real estate deals, shouldn't be making big decisions about his or her life, because this child is a minor, has not yet reached the age where he or she should be making those kinds of decisions. And we saw in chapter 4, the minor is immature because this child is just being tossed about by every wind of doctrine that blows through. Every wave that comes by, every circumstance moves this person in another direction. Rootless, disconnected, no anchor, sail, or rudder, just being blown about by whatever happens to be happening on the water. So that was the idea of a minor back in chapter 4. But this is talking about something else. It uses a different word here. Paul is not using the word for kind of legal status like minor. He's using the word just more commonly about age, a child. But he describes this child as a beloved child. That's a child who is deeply rooted in a safe, nurturing affection from mom and dad. And that child is bonded. That child is connected emotionally to his or her parents. And that child is not being blown about by every wind that happens to blow or every wave that happens to pass. That child is not immature in a way. That child is bonded, connected, anchored relationally in the love of his or her parents. And so, there's something that children do when they're feeling safe and free and they know that people love them. They imitate the people around them. And this is saying, be imitators of God as beloved children. So one of the things I loved most about being a dad of babies, baby boys, is that before they even had words, the boys would kind of mimic the way we would talk. And so I'd be changing one of the boys on the changing table, and he'd be talking to me using no words, just vocal inflections, just a little bit of rhythm here and there, telling me some kind of story. And I didn't know what it was. I didn't care. I just wanted to hear him talk. It's wonderful. Now, of course, the boys later imitated stuff that I would rather they didn't imitate, like my driving, for example. They're doing better than I am at this. But children, when they are in that kind of loving, rooted relationship, they imitate the parent and they learn how to be from the parent. And, some of this is, actually most of it is unconscious. I find myself being like my dad. Maybe that brings you some dismay when you think, oh, this is exactly what my dad would do. I find myself being like my grandfathers. It's a very strange thing that we just take on these traits, these qualities, habits, ways of talking, and it all just happens naturally because we are imitators. That's what we do. We learn by mimicry. So this is saying, your beloved children, Jesus Christ gave himself for you. We just celebrated that at the Lord's table. He was a fragrant offering to you on your behalf because he loves you and he wants fellowship with you. So he sacrificed himself so that you could be in fellowship with him and with his Father. You are beloved. So because you're rooted in that relationship, imitate him. Mimic Jesus. What he did, take that action, take that attitude, take that pattern of behavior and put it into practice yourself. And he's very specific about what we are to imitate. Are we to imitate Jesus the teacher? Not necessarily. Are we to imitate Jesus the debater? That's not mentioned here. It says imitate God, walk in love. That's what God does. So Jesus is forming love in us, his love. And we are to imitate his love primarily in this area of sacrifice. So that when we look at each other, and when we want to have that heart of Christ toward each other, we become people who sacrifice in the interests of others. And that's when we're going through our day, that's what we're asking. What can I give? Where can I give it? Where is the need? And how can I look to the Lord to supply that need? It might not be financial. It might be emotional. It might be very practical. But there is something that Jesus has given to you, formed in you, that you can imitate him and then give in sacrifice to others. So that is, Paul is saying, appropriate. It is fitting. That's who you are. You're a beloved child. So imitate your Father and the Lord Jesus Christ. Walk in love. Now, the contrast, beginning at verse 3, is with idolaters. And here we've crossed over into behavior that is not proper, not fitting. If these are the defining characteristics of your life, then you've got a crisis of identity, because they are not proper as the characteristics of a Christian. If these are the defining characteristics of your life, they're not fitting. They're not appropriate. It is not beautiful in your life. There is a clash, a mismatch between who you are and what you are doing. So let's look at all of these words. The first three in verse 3 of chapter 5, they're very familiar. Sexual immorality. So this is any kind of sexual behavior outside of marriage, outside of that covenant. So sexual immorality is not a proper, prominent characteristic of a Christian. It doesn't work. It doesn't fit. It doesn't match who you are. You are a beloved child of the Son of God who gave himself for you. In your sexual intimacy, the only issue is whether you are giving yourself for the other person in the marriage. If the sexual intimacy is outside of that covenant marriage relationship, you are not giving, you are taking. So the concept of sexual morality here and what is proper for a Christian is that the sexual relationship be within this covenant of absolute safety, a covenant of where intimacy is about giving and receiving, not taking and using. So this already is a total clash with our society and the way our culture works. I don't think it's a headline for us to say nobody in our culture would think now to apply the words proper and fitting to sexual behavior. Because all the behavior is fine. It's all good. It just depends on what you want, and it depends on the consent of the person you're doing it with. The Bible is saying consent is weak. You can get consent. How much consent in sexual relationships is gained through emotional manipulation and false promises? Quite a lot. It's consent. You said yes, but how did you get to yes? That's the issue. It's the lack of covenant promises around the sexual intimacy that is the problem here, and that is not appropriate or fitting for a Christian, because a Christian is not going to emotionally manipulate somebody in order to use their body, even with consent. A Christian is going to say, this sexual intimacy is about your deep value as a person, and so I am going to protect that. So sexual immorality is at the top of the list. All impurity, uncleanness is the root idea here. So this is going back to the law and saying there is in the world an uncleanness, an impurity that keeps us away from fellowship with God. God is absolutely pure. He is holy. There is nothing of a corrupt mixture inside of him. And so there is no uncleanness that can come into the presence of God. I'll just make this observation. It might be tempting to take this word unclean and tie it to sexual immorality as if those two had an equal sign between them. I just want you to think back over the law and think about how much uncleanness is associated with death. And I want you to think over how much our society is becoming a society of death. It's kind of like if you can't make your life work the way you want it to, then there's an out. Did you know that in some countries, I think Canada is currently considering legislation to make assisted suicide available to minors? The mentally ill, the emotionally ill. You don't even have to have in this scheme, you don't even have to have a terminal illness diagnosis to have access to this. Young people, can I make a really strong statement to you? Our society only offers you two things for fulfillment in life. Just two. Sex and suicide. I think if you look carefully at what you're being told about sexuality, it is the ultimate fulfillment of your life. And so if you can't get that, or if you're no longer able to attract that, what else is there for you but to die? We are headed into very grim times because this is not going to stop where it is right here in our society. And so I want you to look at that word uncleanness and think about the whole idea that death or suicide might be a solution to your problems. That takes us deep into the heart of uncleanness. There's another very common word here, covetousness, or greed. So this is also a word that appears in many places in the Bible. It's very familiar. But I just want you to notice that in verse 5, Paul says someone who is covetous is an idolater. That is a worshiper of a false god. So greed is this impulse to say more, more, more. Give me more of what I want. I had enough yesterday, but this is today. I need more. I'm not sure the supply is going to last for the next 10 years or for the rest of my life, so I need to acquire more and more and more. The drug culture that we are in, which I would say is not just illegal drugs, but also legal drugs, is a kind of, the idea of addiction is an outgrowth of greed. It's your body and your emotions hardwired saying, more. I need more. And I can never have enough. So Paul says these things are not fitting, they're not proper for a Christian. They don't match who you are. He says these things must not even be named, and what he means by that is not, boy, if it happens, be sure to cover it up. No, that's not what he's saying, because later in this paragraph he's going to say the light exposes the deeds done in darkness. It doesn't cover up. What he's saying here is there should be no occasion among Christians for naming these things. These should not be prominent characteristics of who we are. It is not proper among saints. So let's look at verse 4 now, and this is where we get into some pretty unfamiliar words. The words here in this verse are only used once in the New Testament, and that's right here. So we're kind of forced to go back to some classical Greek definitions of these terms to try to understand what they mean. Let there be no filthiness. Other possible translations of this, ugliness or baseness. So again, this connection, a deep connection between what is beautiful and what is good. You flip that around, what is sinful is not beautiful. It is ugly. It is base. And so Paul here says, let there be no filthiness, ugliness. Maybe a good modern word for this would be obscenity. Observation here. When you hear someone speaking with obscenities, I'll just tell you what I hear. I hear someone who is straining to elevate himself or herself above everything around them. And the only way they can do that is by applying obscene words to every object in their experience. I don't hear humor. I don't hear confidence. I hear just a kind of dead self-concept that is insisting that I'm above everything else, and the only way you can put everything else down beneath you is to call them by obscenities. That's a personal observation. I can't prove that, but that's what I think. Let there be no obscenity, nor foolish talk, a second word where this is the only occurrence of this word in the New Testament. So it's a compound word. It's literally moron talk. So moros, the word for fool. And so some translations will call this silly talk, as if the New Testament was prohibiting Monty Python or something that's not in view here. If you take this word moron, moros, and separate it from the word for speaking, that word is common. It's all over the New Testament. So where does the fool show up? Jesus talks about folly in Matthew. Let's just look at a couple of occasions of this. Matthew chapter 7, verse 26, everyone who hears these words of mine and does not do them will be like a foolish man, a moron, who built his house on the sand. There's no good foundation for what you're building. So the idea here, and you've got Jesus using this for the wise and foolish virgins in that parable. There are 5 virgins who know that the bridegroom is going to come at any time, but they don't get ready. And so when the bridegroom comes, they are left behind because they weren't ready for the coming of the bridegroom. This kind of usage is what Jesus talks about. He also calls, if you look at Matthew 23, he calls the Pharisees fools because they are making all of these fine distinctions about how to take a good vow and what to take your oath upon. Not the temple, but the gold of the temple and all of this kind of stuff. And he says, you're fools talking like this. So I think we understand where Paul is headed with this. Foolish talk is any kind of conversation where we're saying, in essence, yeah, God says this, but you can get around it. You can build your life without it. And Paul says that is absolutely not fitting for the Christian life. Another word only used once, crude joking, could be used of kind of witticisms, but probably here it means just like low jesting, more obscenity, really kind of obscene puns or something like that. So what it is saying here is these things are not fitting. Paul says they are, in the translation of the ESV, out of place. Notice the contrast. Instead, let there be thanksgiving. So I'm not trying to stuff everything down under my feet lower than I am by using obscenities. I'm not trying to gain more and more and more all the time. Instead, I am exhibiting thankfulness for all that Christ has given to me. So again, like that beloved child looking to the parent, grateful, adoring for what God has given to us. That's at the heart of the contrast here. He makes a very strong statement in verse 5. For you may be sure of this, that everyone who is sexually immoral or impure, unclean, or who is covetous, that is, an idolater, a worshiper of a false god, has no inheritance in the kingdom of Christ and God. So, where are we to go with this as Christians? We're to go back up to verse 2, walk in love. Christ loved us. He gave himself as a fragrant sacrifice for what? For all of this sin, all of it. He has paid for it. He has removed it from us. He has forgiven us for it. So what is proper to us, a pronounced characteristic, should be thankfulness, should be walking in love. What is fitting for us, what matches that identity of a beloved child, it is that gratitude, that imitation of Christ's love for us. So a couple of thoughts here, and then I'll see if there are any questions. What we're really talking about here is restoring a lost model of discipleship. This is like going to the antique store or the junk shop and finding something and saying, hang on, that's not just some dusty old print hanging on somebody's wall of a strange-looking painting. That is a Picasso. And so I'll get that for $35 because I know what it's worth. We're talking about things that the world has discarded as junk. Proper behavior. What is fitting? What is appropriate? What does that even mean anymore? Well, the sacrifice of Jesus on the cross tells us what is proper for a Christian, what is fitting, what is appropriate. This is a concept that needs to come back, because without this, you can't measure what is good and what is right. So we're looking to restore this, and we're asking really a very simple question. It's a question you can take with you this week. What behavior matches who you are? If I'm a beloved child, if I'm a follower of Jesus Christ, then what behavior matches that? It's entirely possible that you have an identity decision in front of you today. A question of, who are you really? Let me look and see if there are any questions about this. A couple of them. What if one failed imitating God? Does one have another chance? What if it feels like he or she has, I'm having trouble with this one. What does it feel like if he or she has another chance? So this question is asking, boy, is this pass-fail here? You commit one infringement and you're no longer imitating God. Are you out? No, Paul would be saying, as we saw a couple of weeks ago, your job is to be renewed. You're in a process. You're putting off the old self and you're putting on the new self. And the glory of what Christ has done for us is He's paid the tuition for us to go to holiness school and get a few F's, or maybe a lot of F's, and fail this subject and have to take it again. He has purchased everything we need to learn holiness. Not just the absolute standard itself, but the whole process of getting there. That is security, that is confidence. So no, this is not a pass-fail thing. We are to learn by imitation, and that's why Paul brings up mimicry here in that way. Let's see how far I can get here. Who is the idol when someone is covetous? Okay, so a covetous person is an idolater, a worshiper of false gods. Maybe it would help to think about what worship is. Worship is service. Worship is saying to your God, I will follow you, I will serve you, I will obey your commands. What this is saying, and the whole idea of covetousness in the Bible is, when you are given over to coveting and greed, your whole heart is serving your master, whatever that is. Could be a drug, could be a status, it could be money, it could be art, it could be anything. And so the idea here is that greed, saying more, I need more, that is enslaving you in service to the thing that you're greedy for.